I was married to my ex-husband, Alan, until about 4 months ago. We split up after I caught him cheating with another woman. At the time, I was pregnant and had been staying at my mom's place for a week. I thought it would be nice to surprise Alan by coming home early. I even planned to make him breakfast before he left for work, since he'd been saying how much he missed me. But when I got home, I found him in bed, with someone else. I completely lost it. I screamed and yelled so loud the whole neighborhood probably heard me. I was in total shock. Alan started panicking, apologizing over and over, but instead of owning up to what he did, he actually tried to blame me. He said I shouldn't have come home early and should have called first, like it was my fault for catching him in the act. I was devastated and furious. I demanded to know who the woman was, but Alan dodged the question, saying it didn't matter and we could talk about it later. But there was no way I was waiting for later. The woman didn't even seem sorry. She looked completely cold and unbothered, like this wasn't her first time in my house. When I asked her point blank if she was having an affair with my husband, she just nodded, totally shameless. Alan yelled at me to ignore her, saying he'd explain everything later. Meanwhile, she rolled her eyes at him and started getting dressed. That's when I noticed something that made me feel sick. She was wearing my red nightgown. I was completely stunned. What kind of person wears someone else's clothes while sleeping with their husband? I yelled at her to take off my nightgown, my voice trembling with rage and shock. I demanded to know what she was thinking, wearing my clothes after what she'd done. The whole thing made me furious. She just shrugged and said she didn't have anything to wear, so she went through my closet and picked something out. Then, with this awful smirk, she looked at my pregnant belly and said, "It's not like you can fit into these anymore anyway." That's when I completely snapped. Who did she think she was? Coming into my home, sleeping with my husband, and then having the nerve to wear my clothes? I didn't even think. I just lunged at her, grabbed her hair, and pulled as hard as I could. She screamed and tried to fight back, but I was taller and stronger, so she couldn't get away. Honestly, if I hadn't been pregnant, I would have done a lot more. But I had to think about my baby. Alan finally stepped in and pulled her away from me. But then she had the nerve to yell at him, saying she was going to kill me for touching her hair and that he better stand up for her if he ever wanted to see her again. The way she talked to him, it was like she was in charge, like she was his partner. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just some random fling. They clearly had a relationship. She wasn't just some woman. She was someone important to him. And then, to my shock, Alan turned on me. He started scolding me for hitting her, telling me I needed to calm down and be more rational. Couldn't believe it. He was the one who cheated, and now he was making me out to be the problem. I demanded to know who she was and what was going on between them. That's when Alan admitted that ever since I got pregnant, he'd felt less attracted to me. He said he'd met Lila, the woman I caught him with, and that she gave him something I couldn't. Hearing that felt like a knife to the heart. When I heard what he said, it felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. All those months, all the love I thought we had, meant nothing to him now. Then he dropped the bombshell. What started as casual flings between him and Lila had turned into something serious. Alan casually mentioned he'd been planning to tell me but decided to wait until after I gave birth to spare me the pain. As if that was some kind of kindness. He'd already made up his mind to leave me. I was crushed. Here I was, pregnant with his child, and he was out there with another woman. For 4 years I stood by him, through his career, his dreams, his struggles. And this was how he repaid me? By betraying me like this? The anger and hurt were unbearable. It felt like everything I'd given, all the sacrifices I'd made, meant nothing to him. I told Alan there was no point in waiting until after the baby was born to divorce me. If he was so sure he didn't love me anymore, why drag it out? His excuses didn't matter to me. He tried to say we could talk about it later, but I was done. The pain was too much and I couldn't hold back. I told him straight up to pack his things and get out of my house, and to take his mistress with him. The nerve of him bringing her into my home, into my bed, was more than I could handle. Even if he didn't love me anymore, how could he disrespect me like this? Alan was shocked. He didn't expect me to stand up to him like that. He tried to argue, but I wasn't having it. I told him if he didn't leave, I'd call the police. I wasn't letting him stay another second. Finally, he gave in and started packing. As they were leaving, Lila had the gall to taunt me. She said everything Alan had told her about me was true, that I was cold and calculating. She even said that's why no man could stay with me. Her words cut deep, like pouring salt on an open wound. And Alan? He didn't say a word to defend me. They left without a single apology. without a shred of remorse. As soon as the door shut behind them, I completely fell apart. The betrayal, the hurt, the loss. It all hit me at once, and I couldn't hold back the tears. I cried harder than I ever had before. But even in that moment of despair, a small part of me knew I couldn't let them destroy me. My mom had raised me to be strong, to stand up for myself no matter what life threw at me. So, as broken as I felt, I pulled myself together. I wasn't going to let Alan or anyone else take away my self-respect. In the weeks that followed, I got in touch with a lawyer, took their advice, and filed for divorce. Luckily, I'd been smart enough to have Alan sign a prenup before we got married, so the divorce process was quicker and less complicated. Since I was in a much better financial position than he was, I knew it wouldn't turn into a drawn-out fight. The only thing we had to figure out was custody of our child. As the mother, I was given primary custody of our newborn. I would raise my baby and Alan would have supervised visits, at least until our child was older when we could revisit the arrangement. After everything that had happened, I didn't trust him to be alone with the baby, and the lawyer agreed it was in the child's best interest, given the situation. In the end, we both accepted this. 4 days ago, I finally gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. It was an overwhelming experience, but my mom was by my side the whole time. I was so grateful to have her there. I needed all the support I could get. I was still in the hospital recovering when Alan came to visit me and our baby the next day. To my surprise, he seemed genuinely proud to be a father. Despite all the anger I felt toward him, I knew we had to try to be good co-parents for our son's sake. He was what mattered most now. After a while, my mom decided to go home to freshen up. She'd been awake with me for what felt like forever, and I could tell she needed a break. I was exhausted too, physically and emotionally, and all I wanted was some sleep. Alan promised he'd stay in the room and keep an eye on our son while I rested. I told him to wake me if the baby cried, since he'd probably need to be fed, and Alan assured me he would. I woke up 3 hours later to my mom urgently asking me, "Where's your baby?" I was completely out of it, trying to figure out what was going on. We searched the hospital room, but my baby and Alan were gone. My heart started racing, and I could feel the panic setting in. Something was really wrong. I asked the nurses if they'd seen Alan or my son, and one of them told me, to my shock, that she'd seen Alan leaving the hospital with my baby. Hearing that, I was stunned. Alan had no right to take my child without asking me, especially after he'd promised to stay and look after him. My mind was spinning, and I could barely think straight. I grabbed my phone and started calling him over and over, but he didn't answer. Every missed call made me more frantic. My heart was pounding, and I felt like I was about to have a full-blown panic attack. Where did Alan take him? What if my baby woke up hungry? What would he eat? Was Alan planning to take him away from me? Terrifying thoughts kept flooding my mind, and all I could think about was whether my baby was safe. Finally, after what felt like forever, Alan answered, or at least I thought it was Alan. But it wasn't. It was Lila. She calmly told me that my baby was with her and that Alan had brought him over to show off our newborn since I hadn't let her visit me at the hospital. That part was true. Alan had asked if he could bring Lila, and I'd said no because I didn't want to see her. I asked how my son was doing and demanded to talk to Alan so I could yell at him for taking my baby without asking. Lila explained that my son had woken up crying, clearly hungry, so Alan had rushed to the store to buy formula to feed him. She also mentioned that Alan had accidentally left his phone behind, which was why he hadn't answered my calls. I was completely shocked. My son had woken up hungry and crying, and she expected me to just wait? And who gave them the right to feed him formula without my permission as his mother? I immediately told her to bring my son back to the hospital so I could feed him myself. But Lila argued that she and Alan knew what they were doing, claiming they were going to be his parents too and that they knew what was best for him. She even had the nerve to tell me to calm down and said Alan would bring him back after they fed him. Her tone was so cold and dismissive. It was like she was trying to justify keeping my hungry baby away from me. I kept insisting she bring him back, but she kept going on about how she and Alan had read parenting books and were prepared to take care of him without me. Her words only made me angrier. At that point, I knew I had to do something fast. I hung up on her and called the police right away. I told them my ex-husband had taken my newborn son and left him with someone else. I was terrified for my baby's safety, especially since I had just given birth the day before. The thought of him being scared or hurt without me was unbearable. The police acted quickly, and within an hour, Alan and Lila were arrested for kidnapping and putting my child in danger. They brought my son back to the hospital, and I rushed to change and feed him. While he seemed okay physically, I could tell he'd been crying for hours. His little face was red, and it broke my heart to see him like that. The whole thing was a nightmare, but I was so relieved to have him back with me where he belonged. Since then, Alan and Lila have been out on bail, but they're facing charges and will have to go to court soon. I made it clear I wasn't dropping the charges. This wasn't something I could just let slide. My baby's safety was on the line, and they needed to be held accountable for what they did. At first, Alan was completely stubborn, insisting he hadn't done anything wrong. He kept saying I was overreacting and that calling the police was unnecessary. He tried to justify himself by saying he just wanted to show off our son, but it was clear he didn't understand how serious this was. He seemed to think he could just brush it off and walk away without any consequences. But after talking to a lawyer, his attitude changed. Now he's begging me to drop the charges, saying he could go to jail and pleading for my forgiveness. It's like it finally hit him how much trouble he's in. Update 1. I know a lot of you are wondering why Alan and Lila would do something like this, and honestly, I'm just as shocked as you are. When we got divorced, I thought we could at least work together as co-parents for our son's sake. But what Alan did is way out of line. It's something I can't forgive. He had no right to take my baby and leave, especially since he doesn't even have primary custody. Taking my son without telling me or thinking about how it would affect me or the baby shows he has no respect for me as his mother. This isn't just about custody, it's about being a decent, responsible parent. He can't just make big decisions like this without talking to me, especially when it involves our newborn son. Some of you have asked why I called the police, and honestly, it makes me think some people don't understand what it's like to be a parent, especially a mother. Any parent, especially of a newborn, knows you can't just take a baby away from their mom right after birth. Newborns need constant care. Feeding, changing, and being held. It's not something you can just walk away from for a few hours. They need attention around the clock. When my son came back to me, he was crying, his diaper was dirty, and he was hungry. It was heartbreaking to see him like that. No one, especially not Alan and Lila, has the right to put my baby in that position. As a mom, I had to do whatever it took to protect my child and make sure he was safe. Calling the police was the only way to get him back to me right away. How could my ex and Lila decide to buy formula and feed my newborn without even talking to me first? That wasn't their call to make, especially not without involving me, the mother. It's completely unacceptable. And how could my ex leave my baby with someone I barely know? Someone I only know because I caught her sleeping with him. What if something had happened to my baby while he was with her? What if she had hurt him? How could he be so irresponsible? Just thinking about it scares me. I don't regret calling the police. Not even a little. What they did was wrong, and I'm not going to let it slide. I'm so grateful my baby is back with me and that he's okay, but I'm going to make sure Alan and Lila face the consequences for what they did. My son is my priority, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect him, no matter how hard it gets. Update 2. It's been a week since I last shared an update, and I'm happy to say that my baby and I are doing okay now. We're back home, and my mom is staying with us to help out. I've also installed cameras around the house for extra safety. I'm not taking any risks when it comes to protecting my son after everything that's happened. As for my ex, he's been pleading with me to drop the charges against him. He's clearly scared of going to jail, but I've been ignoring him. The other day, he showed up at my place unannounced, looking panicked and desperate. I didn't let him inside. My son was sleeping, and I wasn't about to let him disturb that. Instead, I stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind me. He started going on about how, as the father, he has every right to take our son wherever he wants. He told me to stop acting like the bitter ex and just let everything go. He even had the nerve to ask me to drop the charges and tell the police it was all a misunderstanding. I couldn't believe how bold he was being. I told him I wasn't going to lie or back down, especially when none of this was my fault. But then, completely ignoring everything we've been through, he had the audacity to say that the way I'm handling things, is why he fell out of love with me in the first place. He looked me straight in the eye and said, in this condescending tone, "You're so controlling and rigid. This is why I cheated. You're impossible to deal with. No wonder our relationship fell apart. You suffocate everything you touch." I was stunned. Before I could even respond, he kept yelling, "Do you think you're the only parent here? This is my son too, and I deserve your respect. You had no right to call the cops and get me arrested." To him, it was like everything was my fault. I was the reason he cheated, the reason he fell out of love, the reason he felt trapped. He didn't seem to understand how serious his actions were or that being the father doesn't give him the right to do whatever he wants without consequences. I took a deep breath and stood my ground, looking him straight in the eye. I told him his mind games weren't going to work on me anymore. I wasn't the same naive person he could push around like before. You don't get to stand here and explain why you fell out of love with me, I said. You're the one who cheated, lied, and destroyed everything. I'm glad we're divorced, and honestly, I don't care about you anymore. But this isn't about us. It's about my son. You took him to see your girlfriend just one day after he was born, while I was still in the hospital recovering. You know you had no right to do that. And now you expect me to just let it all go? I don't care if you're scared of going to jail because I'm not dropping the charges. His jaw tightened, and I could see him scrambling for a response. But I didn't let him speak. You don't get to play the victim here, Alan. You made your choices, and now you're dealing with the consequences. You think you deserve mercy just because you're biologically related to my son? Let me remind you, being a father is about actions, not DNA. And your actions have shown how selfish and immature you are. You're not fit to make decisions for him, and I'll make sure the court holds you accountable for what you've done. With that, I shut the door in his face while he kept yelling from the other side. He crossed a line, and I'm not backing down. As for Lila, she's been sending me the most hateful, unhinged messages since everything happened. It's like she's made it her mission to harass me nonstop. Every time I think she can't sink any lower, she proves me wrong. The audacity of this woman is unbelievable. She actually wrote to me saying she was looking forward to being my son's new mommy, but that I ruined her chance because I was jealous and got her arrested. Then she went as far as saying she wished me and my son would die in a car accident and that we didn't deserve to live. I was completely shocked reading that. Who says something so horrible, especially about a mother and her child? She's truly disgusting and heartless. I've saved all of Lila's messages and shown them to my lawyer. We're taking action right away to get a restraining order against her. With how threatening and hateful she's been, it's clear we need to make sure she stays far away from me and my baby for good. Update 3. It's been about a month and a half since I last updated, and yesterday was finally the day of the court hearing. Both Alan and Lila showed up with their lawyers, doing their best to make what happened seem less serious and avoid taking any blame. Alan came up with all sorts of excuses. He claimed he was just trying to be a good dad by taking the baby to Lila while I was asleep and that he planned to bring the baby back to me later that day. He even tried to say it was my fault for not letting him bring Lila along when he visited our son. According to him, he never meant any harm and that I overreacted because of my hormones, calling the police for no reason. But no matter what he said, the facts were clear. He took my baby without asking, left him with someone I hardly knew, and completely disregarded my rights as a mom. There was no justifying what he did. He pleaded with the judge to go easy on him. Lila, as I expected, didn't take any responsibility either. She acted like she had every right to be involved with my son, as if she was some kind of stepmom now. She even accused me of holding a grudge because she stole my husband and claimed I was just trying to make her life harder. That's when my lawyer stepped in and read out loud all the nasty, threatening messages Lila had sent me. It was important for the judge to see the kind of person she really is and why she shouldn't be anywhere near me or my baby. You could see the shock on everyone's faces in the courtroom. It was obvious Lila had no respect for me, my son, or our boundaries. After everything was laid out, the messages, the timeline of events, the police reports, and my testimony, the judge made their decision. Alan was found guilty of kidnapping and putting our child in danger. Lila was also charged for her role in endangering my son. In the end, Alan got 1 year of probation and has to take parenting classes. If he violates his probation, he'll go to jail. Lila was hit with a restraining order and has to stay away from me and my family. That means no more hateful messages from her. And the court made it clear that I, as the mother, have the final say in how my child is raised. Both of them also have to pay for the emotional distress they caused me and my baby. By the end of the hearing, Alan and Lila were clearly furious, but there was nothing they could do. They got what they deserved. Update 4. It's been 6 months since the court hearing, and things are finally starting to feel more normal. My son, who's already 6 months old, which is hard to believe, has brought so much happiness into my life. Every little thing he does, like his first smile, rolling over, and now almost sitting up on his own, makes all the challenges worth it. I'm doing my best to give him a stable, loving home, surrounded by family and friends who really care about him. My mom has been amazing. She visits as much as she can and has been a huge help. Whether it's taking care of my son at night or just being there for me when I need someone to talk to, I don't know what I'd do without her. As for Alan and Lila, they're completely out of our lives. Alan tried to reach out a couple of times, but I ignored him. I'm done with that chapter, and I've made it clear that my son and I are moving on without him. Lila hasn't been an issue either. The restraining orders have worked, and I haven't heard from her since the court hearing. Sure, there are still times when I think about everything that happened with Alan and Lila, and it stirs up some anger and pain. But I try not to let those feelings take over. What's important now is my son and the life we're creating together.